Hello, I'm April Chatham Carpenter.
And I'm Glenn White. Welcome to A Braver Arkansas.
This is a show about how Arkansans can talk to each other across political and other differences and why that matters now. We hope the show will encourage you, our listeners, to find ways to get more involved in your communities in ways that make sense for you.
April and I are both longtime active members of Braver Angels. It's a national organization that has a mission of encouraging people to engage with those on the other side and to do that with respect. That mission is based on the belief that in a constitutional democratic republic like we have, it's imperative that people with differing ideas are able to talk with each other and find common ground on problems we face.
We're going to be explaining much more in today's show about what Braver Angels is and what we do here in the state and why we think a television show is a useful place to demonstrate this work. You know, the inability to talk to the other side or to compromise because of extreme polarization is not good for the country or our citizens or for our relationships. And that's why this work matters, and it's why we're doing this show.
So, April, it's time for folks to know a little bit about us, where we come from, about Braver Angels. Why don't you start off and tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Braver Angels and the kind of impact it's had on you so far.
Sure. Well, Glenn, it's your fault, actually. I remember you had a cold call for me and at the university where I teach and asked me if I knew anything about the organization called Better Angels. At the time, was the name of the organization. And I didn't, and as you started talking about it, it really made me realize how much I could benefit from an organization like this, and I'll tell you why. I had been a student of communication for over 40 years as a professor who teaches relationship communication, conflict management kinds of classes, but I never had taken that work of conflict management into the realm of politics. Maybe it's because I grew up in the South where people were saying, don't talk about politics or religion because you might hurt your relationships. Well, as I began to see that both sides, all sides, were treating each other with contempt, with mockery, and I'm like, okay, it just made me want to not be engaged at all. I was getting tired of it. The presidential elections cycle was vitriolic. It was hostile, the people towards each other, and the fans of the people, the people who were supporting each side. And then COVID came along, and my gosh, the whole idea of masking and not masking became a kind of a flashpoint, and people weren't agreeing. I had to make sure students were wearing masks in a classroom, and some of them didn't agree with that. And in my own family, we had different opinions about it. My relationships actually felt really fragile during that time. So it made me even more want to kind of back off and just stick my head in the sand and not want to do anything with politics. And then, you know, you show up at my door and you said, do you know where you stand politically? At that point, I didn't even know for sure if I was conservative. I grew up being very conservative with my faith and my belief in personal responsibility and community impact, family values. But I didn't want to say I was conservative or liberal because of the culture wars that were going on, and I felt like I'd be attacked. There were people in my family that were much more conservative than I was. And yet, when I hung out with them, I would become like pretty conservative, even more conservative like they were. And then there were people at work and sometimes at my church and just friends that I had outside that were more liberal, and I kind of hang out with them, and I would be like, don't really like the way they're talking about the other side, but I would just sit there and not say anything. And so I oftentimes felt caught in the middle, this kind of you know, it doesn't matter what I say, doesn't matter what I do, because I'm not going to change their opinion or the way they talk or believe about the other side on either side. And so I avoided conversations. I muted people on Facebook, even family members online, because what they said made me mad, and so I'd want to respond back, and then people that I didn't even know would respond back to me, and I'm like, no, we're just going to not do this. I withdrew from it. And yet, here I am teaching classes on conflict management and on good communication and good relationships, and I'm like, I'm really not practicing the communication principles that I teach about. And I came to realize that it's really harder when they're people that you want to talk to or people that you love, because you don't want to lose those relationships. It's one thing if I'm on social media and I don't ever see those people again, but the people that I love, I don't want to lose those relationships. So when you came to me and I started looking into the mission of Braver Angels, and they were talking about good speaking and listening skills, I'm like, that's what I teach. Why wouldn't I be interested in learning more about how to better have conversations in a way that I could listen to the person, not to try to persuade them, not to try to make an argument, but that I could really listen and then make them want to listen to me as well in the way that I was treating them. And could I do that in a political context is what I had to ask myself. And so ended up developing a class that I began teaching on listening and civil dialogue as I got more involved in Braver Angels, and realized that I needed to continue working on hearing both sides, in approaching conversations on any topic, regardless of the side or the position taken, with humility and curiosity. So what it has done for me is it's made me less fearful to have these kinds of conversations. It's made me more intentional and mindful about how I have them. And really, I'm still learning. I don't do it perfectly. There are times in which, and I call it my classes, my lizard brain takes over, and I just say things in the heat of the moment. I mean, you can ask the people that I work with and my family, and they'll say, yeah, she still's learning. And so, but I think it's been a great influence in my life for all those reasons.
You know, it's interesting you talk about how you had your communication background and training, and then you learned some things from Braver Angels, which covered the things that you already kind of knew, but you hadn't thought about applying them to a political context. And I have the same story, actually, because as a psychologist at the time, I'm retired now, but I was very familiar with the kind of things that the Braver Angels skills are based on. They're based on a lot of therapy kind of techniques, which are obviously communication as well. So I was the same way as you were. I saw those skills and those concepts in a new context. It was like I hadn't really thought about it before. In the past, it was about dealing with families and helping them communicate better, or in marriages or parent and child. And then, okay, this new way of thinking about it in terms of political differences and people on different sides politically came up. So that's we have that in common. One other thing that I think might be helpful to mention, we talked about you being more conservative. I tend to be a little more on the liberal side.
A little?
A little, no, yeah, moderate.
Okay,
I would say a moderate.
I'm playing with you a little bit.
I know, but you know, we use a couple of terms that we may use from time to time, so it's probably helpful for the listeners and the viewers to understand this. Red and blue. So when we're talking about red, we're referring to the kind of the conservative end of things, you know, and blue refers to the more liberal or progressive way of thinking about politics.
So are people in the middle purples then? Red and blue, purple?
Actually, we've heard that used several times, so that's true. And I'm sure there are people who would use the term green, you know, like the Green Party, environmentalists. But generally, the red, blue, and purple, because the truth is, no one is all red, no one is all blue. We're all somewhere in the spectrum, and sometimes we have some red, and we have some blue, and we have some purple. Most of us in real life, we're all over the place.
Well, I know it's your fault that I got into Braver Angels because
I'll
you
take the
introduced
blame.
me to it. What brought you into Braver Angels?
Well, okay, I mentioned being a psychologist for a long time and retired in 2018, maybe a little bit longer. But what got me into Braver Angels was I knew that retirement was coming up. And I said, I have to figure out what to do with myself because it is not going to work well for me. I know myself enough to know I would not do well in retirement if all I do is play golf and then sit at home and eat bonbons. That's not going to be good for Glenn. So I decided I need to figure out while I'm still working, I need to figure out what I'm going to do with my time afterwards. And I've always, over the years, been someone who tends to do public service kinds of things. I've done different things. I was active in Sierra Club for a number of years. So I started looking at things, and I tried this, and I tried that. And then at some point I was watching Fareed Zakaria's Global Public Square on CNN a number of years ago, my favorite news analysis program. And he interviewed David Blankenhorn, who was, as you know, one of the co-founders of Braver Angels. And so I did that, and I was like, I like what he's having to say. He was telling the story of this new organization he upstart called, at the time, Better Angels, and we changed to Braver Angels. So I said, well, I got to check that out. And at the same time, this was around 2016, I was really worried about the kind of things you were talking about, the polarization, people hating on each other because of their different political beliefs, and the way things are going in the country just worried me a great deal. And so I said, you know what? I'm a social scientist. I know how to look at the science. So I started exploring the social sciences literature and found a lot of things. In fact, I found out more than I bargained for. It's a very complicated subject to find out the things that contribute to our beliefs and how we change beliefs and things like that. So
I bet we'll hear a lot more about that in our program as we go on.
I plan on it, yes. I've kind of nerded out when it comes to the research on polarization and things like that. So I will be getting into that later, but at least at this point I was starting to learn about that and hearing about the Better Angels thing. I immediately went out and joined. Well, what happened was I joined there, so I belonged to the national organization, but there was nothing in Arkansas. After a few months, got an email to me and maybe about 10 or so other people, apparently in the central Arkansas region, basically saying, hey, you guys are in Arkansas. You might want to talk to each other and see if you can get something going. So some of us communicated by email, and we wound up agreeing to meet for lunch one day at I think it's called Cafe 42, or was at the time, it's the restaurant at the Clinton Presidential Library. So we came, didn't know each other, and we talked about, you know, the organization, Better Angels at the time, and says, okay, what do we want to do? At some point we decided, do we want to do something? The decision was made that we'd get one red and one blue leaning person, and we'd collaborate on an op-ed, an opinion editorial column in one of the local papers. So we thought about different possibilities. What happened was, around that time, I went and talked to the editor at Arkansas Business and told her a little bit about what we were about, and she was interested. So me and the red-leaning person collaborated on an editorial, and it was published in Arkansas Business. That was our first one. We've had a bunch done since then, but that's kind of how that went. In terms of other aspects, I would tell you that my social media behavior changed quite a bit as a result of the influence of Braver Angels. I started thinking about, because I've always had strong opinions politically, and I wasn't afraid to share them.
I know, I've heard them.
In social media and with other people. But when I got to Braver Angels and started hearing the skills and the approach, I said, you know, maybe if I'm going to be involved in this organization, I need to tone it down a bit and follow more of, you know, what we're supposed to be preaching, you know, practice what you preach. And so I did that, and interesting thing happened, and this is a lesson for our viewers, that social media and the algorithm is based upon engagement, and that's usually through strong emotions like fear and anger. When I toned down what I had to say on social media, I got a lot fewer engagements, I got a lot fewer likes, and so be prepared for that. It's a good thing to do, but you know, if you really get off on all the interaction and the strong emotions on social media, that's what they're counting on to sell their advertising, and you'll see a reduction in how you get reaction from other people. I think it's a good thing, and we can talk more about that later, but that's one of the other things I had change about my own behavior. I think the other thing is that in terms of personal relationships, it made a difference, but where it was really important was with my family. I have a family that largely, not entirely, but largely leans pretty conservative. They're in another state, so we don't see each other very often. And so when I come visit, we get into discussions about politics. And I became aware through Braver Angels and the understanding of the way to approach this that I wasn't really accomplishing anything. I wasn't changing anybody's mind. And if anything, they'd either get more angry and dug in, or what usually happened was like, let's not talk about that. Let's not talk politics. And so we didn't. But I have learned, and I continue to learn the lesson that we need to be a little more mindful about how we approach people and how we deal with things like that. Mm-hmm. So I'm just thinking, you know, I still have a long way to go, but you know, I'm working at doing better and following the skills, and with the expectation and the belief and some evidence that when you do that, the improvement in relationships will follow.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting, Glenn, there's some things that I hear in common between us. One is that we approached kind of these political conversations differently. I mean, that doesn't sound like it's in common, but we had to make a choice. For you, it was early on before Braver Angels, you would actually be more forthright maybe in what you were saying and say it in a way that might get some reactions. For me, I chose to do kind of the opposite of that. We both made choices, which is the common ground that I was trying to think. But I chose to do the opposite, which is that I would basically just not choose to engage at all. But we found in Braver Angels a way to help us improve our skills in interacting with others, and especially with our families and other people. So I see that in common. Well, let's move in and talk just a little bit about kind of bridging, getting ready to talk about Braver Angels and what we do. You know, politics, I think, Glenn, you and I agree, it's one of our greatest divides. I mean, the Pew Research Group has done multiple polls, kinds of studies, and has found that politics is even a greater divider these days than age or gender or you know, economic status even, or even more than even race these days, which was surprising to me, and I was reading about that. And I know that it also has impacted our relationships greatly.
Yeah, makes a big difference. In fact, one of the studies I've seen recently is that 37% of Americans have actually ended a relationship over political differences. Wow. Mostly it's about friendships, but I know personally people who it's cost them in terms of family. I hear stories about work. The common thread there is the negative impact on relationships. That's critical. We'll get to other things, including the impact on our government later, but that's a key.
Yeah, so Braver Angels, we'll talk more about how it got started in a little bit, but their response to kind of this polarization was to start teaching skills, right? So the speaking and listening skills that we'll be covering in this series, these episodes coming up. And really the emphasis is not on changing beliefs of the other person, which makes some people feel uncomfortable, right? Because some people, all of us can think, you know, I am right on a particular kinds of setting or situation or topic, and they want to like persuade the other people to believe that they're wrong. But this is not really about persuasion in that way. It's about listening. It's about building relationships, building civic friendships, and really building things that can lead to the recognition that we have community problems in our individual communities wherever we live, whether it be rural or urban, that we need each other to come together to help solve.
And that's why we have Braver Angels, and that's why we're talking about Braver Angels. So I think it would be helpful at this point to make sure that the viewers understand better what Braver Angels is. You've heard a little bit about it, but April, can you tell us a little bit about the history, kind of how it started? Because you've been involved at a national level for quite a while. You know all the national leaders. Fill us in on those aspects.
Yeah. So it started in 2016, actually. There was a group of people in a small area in Ohio that they were neighbors. They had been friends. Kids went to school with each other. And at the time, what happened in 2016, we had a presidential election. It was Hillary Clinton against Donald Trump, and Trump won. Well, those people kind of broke off their relationships with each other. And one of the co-founders of the organization, David Lapp, actually knew some people that he thought could come in and help them have a conversation that was grounded in good communication principles. And so he asked Bill Doherty, who was a University of Minnesota marriage and family therapist professor, but also did therapy on the side as well, to come in and develop a workshop, which they now call the Red-Blue Workshop. And they ended up showing them how they could talk across the political divide and begin to understand each other. It really was focusing at that point on speaking and listening skills, on kind of debunking stereotypes of the other, getting them in the same room to realize that some of their concerns about where the country was headed were similar, so that they weren't just thinking of each other kind of outside of relationships. And it became this movement that's part of many in the U.S. that tries to work on bridge building. Now, the name itself actually came from President Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, and he talked about that we can be better. We don't have to be enemies. We can be friends. This is right before the Civil War, but there were some states that had also already started seceding from the Union. And he said, we need to be better angels of our nature. Call on the better angels of our nature. That name ended up being copyrighted, so we couldn't use that name in the organization. So in 2020, they changed the name to Braver Angels. And gosh, it takes courage now. So it's very much appropriate for what we do. But really, it's one relationship at a time, hearing the stories of other people, trying to realize that we are human beings with much more in common than we are with differences, and focusing on relationships.
Yeah, and the courage it takes, I think that's absolutely right. In fact, we'll later get into some things like courageous conversations and courageous citizenship and things like that. But it's just so important, the relationships that we have, and being mindful of the impact of how we have conversations over differences. So I think that's one of the things I look forward to the viewers learning from what we have to say over the coming weeks.
One of the things that they did after the Red-Blue Workshop is they developed other workshops, right? So one of the workshops was Skills for Bridging the Divide. Now it's called Skills for Disagreeing Better. Another workshop was called Depolarizing Within. That Depolarizing Within workshop actually has evidence to show that a person who takes that workshop, it's a 3-hour workshop, can come in with a certain amount of feelings towards the other group, and the feelings towards the other group of animosity lessen from just taking the workshop. But we use the term depolarization a lot in Braver Angels, and I think it might be helpful just to step back a minute and say, what does depolarization mean? And I know you've studied a lot on polarization. We'll get into that in a little bit, but what does it mean to depolarize ourselves?
Well, briefly, let me just say what polarization is. It's a generic term that talks about opposites, north, south, left, right, up, down. In this case, political polarization is when you're on extreme or opposite views of something. There's actually some benefits to having polarization. Basically, if you have people with different ideas, you have a bigger data set to draw from and different ideas that you can combine to maybe help solve some problems. But the problem is when it gets too serious and too deep. The extreme polarization, which you can call affective polarization because it involves strong emotions, or toxic polarization. With the differences of opinion comes bad behavior and kind of problematic ways of thinking and looking at other people. So depolarization is about trying to reduce the emotions we have and to improve our behaviors so that when we are dealing with people with different opinions politically, then we still kind of keep it between the ditches.
Okay, that makes sense. One of the things we talk about is, why do we need to do this work as citizens, right? Because we oftentimes think about the political side of the house. It's up to the politicians, right? We elect them, but it really is the founder's vision for Braver Angels that everybody should play. We all should play, right? Some people may not have time, though. They may just be able to get educated on voting and be able to vote, and other people might get involved in their communities. Well, we're going to actually take a break now, Glenn, and listen to a video that will tell our listeners a little bit more about what Braver Angels is.
Yeah, very good.
Politics has always been a passionate subject, and we've always had deep political disagreements. That's the way it's supposed to be. But we've gotten to the point where people can't even talk to one another. Americans no longer see their political opponents as simply wrong or misguided. They see them as bad people whose ways of thinking are dangerous and incomprehensible. They see them as enemies. This level of rancor and mistrust threatens our democracy, and it makes it harder for us to move forward as a nation, regardless of who the president is.
The fact that we live in what feels like, some people call it a cold civil war, that takes a toll on all of us.
We've been excommunicated from a lot of our friends in the last couple of years, and it makes me sad.
This is one organization that's doing a lot to kind of overcome that and get people back to where we were, which is neighbors, friends, communities.
We are truly bipartisan. From our staff to our funding to our board of directors, we're evenly split, half conservative, half liberal. Everything we do comes from the bottom up. We're an almost entirely volunteer-led operation. We wanted to see, could we get together a group of folks who'd voted for Trump and a group of folks who'd voted for Clinton and get them in a room together to see how can we bring people together to not get them to agree or to come to the middle, but to maybe change how they think about one another.
When you're there in person and you have to face the person you're talking to, we remember suddenly the rules of civil discourse and kind of how we should act in society. It's something that really distinguishes this form of conversation and debate.
It's all well and good to talk about civility and being nice to people, but the missing ingredient is courage.
The courage that it takes to have a difficult conversation, to put yourself out there.
What we've been saying is that this year, it's not enough to call in our better angels. We have to call in our braver angels.
The name Braver Angels captures the evolving spirit of better angels. We have to be willing to summon the courage to see the best in the other side, see the best in our fellow Americans.
Courage means becoming a leader in your own community who's standing up for America, not just for your political party or your tribe or folks with whom you share an identity, but standing up for something larger that we can all believe in. If we can create a large enough movement that is clamoring for a more courageous style of politics, we can change the incentives.
That's something that can only be achieved through what we call patriotic empathy, this idea that your love for your country is demonstrated in your love for your fellow American. As braver angels, we're able to lean into that with courage and boldness.
It will make you feel like we can serve this place and our country can serve humanity in a way that is actually beautiful and actually does us justice.
This is not a left-wing movement, this is not a right-wing movement, but it is indeed an American movement. We still have it in us to be champions for what is right and what is graceful and what is decent here in the United States.
Go to braverangels.org. Sign up to join our email list. And at the end of the day, try to treat each other with respect, empathy, and find the courage needed to talk to people, even if, and perhaps especially when, you don't agree with them.
Glenn, one of the things that I really loved about that video was just watching the people talk about the impact of Braver Angels for themselves. And having met a lot of the people that were on that video through my work with National and Braver Angels, I was able to actually get to know them personally. Monica Guzman, who was on that and wrote the book, I never thought of it that way. She actually came to the University of Arkansas at Little Rock a couple years ago and met with our Braver Angels Arkansas group. And John Wood Jr., he talked with a student group at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, I think. So we have some connections even from those national people here, but just hearing them talk again about the hope that they have is really encouraging, and it reminds me of why we joined Braver Angels to begin with.
Yeah, and remember, Monica Guzman actually appeared on our podcast for a couple of episodes, so listeners can still go back and hear what she had to say. It was really cool to have her on there.
Yeah, I remember. It was a great interview.
So what the video shows is what Braver Angels hopes to accomplish in our work. Why that? Why that approach where we have a more maybe kind and gentle and respectful approach? Why does that work, and when argument maybe doesn't? Tell us a little more about that.
This is so hard because when you feel so strongly about a topic like politics or something that might involve morality or issues that are so central to your identity, it's very difficult not to come across as dogmatic and just spout out facts to other people. But the research actually shows that it's not the facts that actually cause people to be persuaded. It's the relationships, it's the stories that we hear people tell. And if I think about the times in my life in which I have made, like, U-turns or even slight turns in a particular way on anything, It's because I've trusted the people that are actually giving me that information, and not because they're throwing out facts to show that they're superior to me. And I think that's one of the reasons why we don't want to get into this tit for tat sometimes conversations with people, because we're afraid we're going to look stupid because we don't have all the facts and the other people do, and they're spouting facts at us. Well, as soon as you come into a conversation feeling fearful or feeling like you're not valued, then you're very likely not going to have the conversation at all. And so if we don't have the conversations, we don't get to know the people. I oftentimes think about the story of Daryl Davis, and some of our listeners may be familiar with Daryl, but he was a black musician in the South, and I don't remember what state that he was in. Do you remember?
No,
okay.
I don't.
But he decided that he would be playing at these gigs at these clubs, and there would be Ku Klux Klan members that would come into the club. He knew that they were those people, and so he decided I could either just like ignore them. They would compliment him on his music, but I could either ignore them or I could actually reach out and maybe build a relationship with them. Now, I don't think I could have done that if I had been him, but he tells the story, if people listen to interviews that he's done, of actually going into Ku Klux Klan meetings and then inviting some of the leaders into his home, and he eventually got invited into their home. There's one funny story that he tells about, the bodyguards for both of them were there, and they didn't know which one was going to pull the gun first. But it didn't end up with violence. It ended up with actually him calling, what some people would call calling into relationship. And the calling into relationship is so, so important, where we're not just always advocating for our side, but we're saying, can I learn about you? Can I see if there's anything in my life that I might have in common with you? I was on the airplane yesterday, or a couple of days ago, and I saw two people that I thought, I'm not going to mention what their identity looks were, okay, because I don't want to offend my viewers. I'm kind of, this desire to not offend is part of who I am. And so, but I thought when I looked at them, those two people who they sat next to each other, I knew that they weren't there together because the second person came in late, and they didn't look like they had anything in common. In fact, the identity markers of what one person was wearing and what the other person looked like they would just sit and be on their phones or be in their books and not talk to each other. They were sitting three rows up from me. I don't know what they talked about, but they were laughing, they were talking, they were equally communicating, and I bet that after that, they would have a different impression of that group of people, that identity marker, the clothing or the things that the person was wearing look like, because they had that conversation. That's the power of relationship. I get to know somebody who's in a different group than me, who has a different opinion than me, and all of a sudden, I'm like, well, they're not like that. I thought all of those people were like that, but they're not. And that relationship has more power over time to change a person. So what happened with Daryl Davis was the Ku Klux Klan grand leader, whatever the master person is called, ended up giving up his robes, so Daryl has the robes of that person. Now, did Daryl go in there, and some people would ask me, I tell this story in my classes, well, he went in there with the goal of persuading. Maybe, but he didn't go in there with the lead, you're wrong. And if I come into any conversation with throwing out facts, my facts are better than yours, your facts are wrong, I am going to completely turn off the other person.
The quote I've seen attributed to Daryl Davis says something like, I didn't try to convert them, I just, tried to develop a relationship with them and let the relationship allow them to convert themselves, basically. Mm-hmm. There's another piece from kind of my end of things in psychology. We've known for a long time that one of the big predictors about positive outcome in psychotherapy is the strength of the relationship between the therapist and the client. Mm-hmm. There are some other things, but that's one key aspect. So that's a research that says relationships matter. And we've also since then found out other ways that relationships matter. We know, for instance, that most hostage negotiators these days use that idea of establishing rapport with the person they're negotiating with, and it may be a life or death thing, and you certainly don't agree with what they're doing or maybe what they're standing for, but what works best is that type of relationship. We know that works in like marriage and family therapy, it works in parent-child relationships. There's plenty of evidence out there. Interrogation of terrorists and enemies of the country that you always hear about the torture. That's what the movies and the TV shows say works, but the truth is what works best, it's a little bit longer term, but what works best is establishing rapport and relationship.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I remember, Glenn, when Monica Guzman was on the UA Little Rock campus, that somebody asked her a question in her presentation, but isn't there a red line in the sand that if a person crosses this red line, you will no longer have a relationship with them? And she stopped and she thought about that and she said, I don't have a red line because I approach conversations with what can I learn? And I think that's something that is an important thing for us to be thinking about. But I also think that there are times in which we need to be doing the advocacy work, right? We need to be calling out people to better behavior. And so it's not just always about calling in, but it's also about calling out. Why do you think this matters in Arkansas?
Well, it matters in Arkansas for the same reason it does for the rest of the country, that we have a really strong division these days politically, and you can see the kind of things that it's resulted in. I think I alluded to this before, that the research shows in other countries where there are democracies that if you don't have some ability to talk across differences and resolve things, you're going to have serious problems. One of the things it does is the different sides get entrenched in their own beliefs and they refuse to do anything to help the other side out. So there's none of this win-win thing. It's a win-lose thing. And when that happens, and especially if you have a fairly close division, basically each side stops the other from doing anything. That means that problems in the country don't get resolved. And when people start thinking their problems are not being resolved, they're saying something's wrong with our government or the people leading it, and they want to see something different. And if it becomes a continued problem where you can't get one side or the other to do some compromising, eventually it lays the groundwork for an autocratic leader to start to have an influence and take over. What they'll do typically in most countries is to say that things are going badly here, but I can fix it, I can make things better, but we have to take care of this, and they always name a scapegoat group, and they do something to try to address, I'm going to take care of things, I'm going to resolve the problem with this group that's the real problem. And people, out of desperation, if nothing else, wind up voting for someone because nothing else has worked. And then when a person like that gets in power, they start to dismantle the democratic institutions or make them ineffective. And we've seen this, political scientists have seen this around the world in other democracies, that process of things going downhill and losing those democratic means of governing. So it's really important that we do something about that.
So Glenn, I have a question for you just to follow up. You said in Arkansas that we have a lot of polarization. I know we've had multiple guests on our podcast that have talked a little bit about the history of politics in Arkansas, and we certainly have kind of seen that switch over time. What are you thinking about polarization levels in Arkansas? What have you seen out there?
Well, again, first there's two things. One, the government right now in Arkansas is very heavily Republican. So on the red side, the red end of things pretty much has control of the government now.
And is that a bad thing?
Well,
I'm playing with you. I'm just playing with you.
I'm not going to answer that. That's a separate question.
Yeah.
But the point is, because you could have gone back a number of years and said the same thing about the blue side, right? It was all Democratic until at some point it was all Republican. The point is, it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. If one side gets everything done and the other nothing, or if neither of them can get anything done. In terms of, so that's the aspect of the government, but in terms of political polarization, even though probably a substantial majority of people in Arkansas now favor the red end of things, you still see it all the time with people who have different opinions having difficult conversations or none at all. Mm-hmm. And so I think the problem is still there in terms of not being able to work things out. The other thing is that the evidence is that we know, like in group decision-making research, that if you have two groups, one group that has all experts on a particular question, and you're asked them to solve this problem that they're experts on, you have another group that has some experts, but it has a lot of other people from other walks of life who don't necessarily have any expertise. Consistently, the research says that group with the variety of people in it winds up having more good ideas because you have a greater set of ideas and data to go from, and you have creative things come up that all the experts used to thinking a different way, the same way about it, wouldn't necessarily think about. So it's really important to have everybody at the table, to have a voice, and to be willing to listen to it. And of course, with high polarization, you often aren't listening. You're thinking about how you're going to prove your point and, in response, so you really don't care what they say.
So we need each other. I mean, that's what I'm hearing you say, is that we need each other. And in talking to other people in other states, some of which have more of a bipartisan kind of form of government in terms of, in Braver Angels, they talk about that they have to actually work together to get a bill passed. I mean, most of us, unless we're in politics and behind the scenes or doing lobbying work, we don't know what it takes, the conversations that go on behind the doors and over coffee with our legislatures. We've had a couple on, actually, that we're going to be having on our program. We think eventually that will maybe talk about what is it like to actually work together across the aisle to come up with something that's even better, that all Arkansans can actually work with.
Yeah. So it might be helpful now at this point, kind of coming back around to Braver Angels and what we do. You've seen both the local and the national end of things. Fill us in a little bit on what Braver Angels does, because there's a lot going on, I know, and you know more about that than I do.
Yeah. So at the national level, we offer, and COVID really helped with this, because we offer a lot of national kinds of workshops and debates that people can attend. If people go to braverangels.org, they'll be able to find a lot of resources. So people can get involved without getting involved locally. But I'm going to talk a little bit about both kinds of those angles. At the national level, there's even, if a person would join, there's even a dojo AI partner that you can pick out different people, different kind of personas that you can kind of spar with a little bit. It'll give you ideas of how you can do that better. There's one-to-one conversation guides. I use those in my classes where students will talk to somebody that's from a different generation than them, maybe a grandparent, or they may talk about somebody who's a different culture from them. So it doesn't have to be just red-blue. We recognize that difference is not just about the Republican Democrat kind of difference or red-blue differences. So we offer those kinds of things. What the national level does also is it gives all kinds of resources to states and to local entities to be able to offer their own programming. And so we have trained in Arkansas, in our Braver Angels Arkansas statewide alliance, we have trained ambassadors who will go in and actually give presentations. And we basically ask when a group comes to us and says, well, what kind of presentation would you like? Well, how long do you want? What format do you want it in? You gave one recently where it was a question-answer format. We've given some where it's more of a PowerPoint presentation. And so we've given things to Rotary clubs, to university classes. We just did a presentation to Girl State recently. We've given presentation in churches, at libraries, and so we have lots of opportunity or would like to offer that as an opportunity for our listeners to actually, if you have a presentation that you would like us to give, we have polarization presentations, we have presentations on media literacy. We have presentations on speaking and listening behaviors and things that we'll be talking about over these episodes. So that's one of the things that we do. We also offer workshops, and at the national level they have created workshops that are anywhere from 1.5 hour long workshops to 6 hour all-day workshops. And the 1.5 hour ones are more introductory, kind of let's think about yourself, and we've got a skills for disagreeing better and depolarizing ourselves that are 1.5 hours now. And then we have longer skills-based workshops also. And then the ones that make so much difference though, when you can actually get into the room with people who have different opinions than you. And so the Red-Blue workshop that was started in Ohio, that has continued now where people can offer it. And then there's a Common Ground workshop there when people have a topic. Right now they're going around the country, for example, on immigration and offering these Common Ground workshops with people from different perspectives on immigration to see what are the things that we have in common in terms of our concerns, in terms of our values, in terms of possible policy issues that can be done. And so we have a lot of material in this kind of bridge building space that can be done. One of the things, I'm state coordinator right now for Braver Angels in Arkansas, that I'm hoping will happen is that we will have local groups, what they call, most people would call them chapters, but in Braver Angels we call them alliances. I think it's because it's an alliance of different opinions, different perspectives is why they call it alliances. And we recently had one start up in Northwest Arkansas. They basically, to start an alliance, you have to have people from different political perspectives who are interested in talking to each other with dignity and respect.
And having actual votes on what you decide to do, having both red and blue or
so
purple or whatever.
So there's representation, absolutely.
Yeah. I was trying to think.
And then we have our podcast. You should tell them about that.
Well, okay, I'll tell you that. And after I do that, I want you to talk about the debates because I think that's kind of cool. The podcast, but that's at the national level. We hope to have that coming here locally at some point. But the podcast is probably why we're doing this TV show, because people heard about the podcast. We had a couple of people on that were interested in what we were doing. But we started about 3.5 years ago. Once again, I remember sitting in your office. This is how it started because I'd
different office at that point.
A different office,
yeah.
And I was having this thought that what else could I do in my retirement? And I was thinking, podcast. I knew a little bit about it, but not a lot. But from what I could tell, it might match with my kind of skill set that I had as a psychologist. I certainly have done a lot of interviewing and talking and leading groups, and I thought, okay. It might be interesting to just have conversations with people. So I thought, well, the podcast might be good, but I don't think I'm capable of handling it all by myself. I would need a partner. So I was talking with you about that one day in your office, and you said, well, I'll help you. I'll do that. And I was like, well, okay. Then I guess my bluff's been called. So I'm going to have to do something. And so we decided to do it. Well, the other potential roadblock is I'm not a very techie guy, so I don't always know what I'm doing. And then lo and behold, I mentioned us doing something like this, and one of our other members, David, knew somebody who had expertise in doing that kind of thing. So I think he kind of voluntold this person, John, to do this with us. And he got together, and for over 3 years, he was our editor, and he coached us on all the technical aspects as well as just some of the other things about how we do this. And it's been really cool since then to see who all we get on the podcast. We try to get people all around Arkansas that are active in the community, that work somehow across various sources of division, somebody who contributes basically. And so we find out a little bit about them. So that's our podcast. Now, and I, you
want to go back to debates?
I do want to mention debates, but also there's a lot of other stuff nationally. I know they've had annual music competition, people writing songs about.
We have a Braver songwriters community.
I understand there's a book club. They have one of our members locally is part of a national if I got this right,
Red Caucus,
Red Caucus, and I think it's actually Red Women
I hadn't heard
caucus.
that. Okay.
So, so there's a lot going on. But yeah, tell us about the debate.
Yeah. So he mentioned debates, and I've forgotten to mention that along with the workshops, we offer this parliamentary style debate. It's really unique. It's not push down the other's ideas so that you can win. There's no winning or losing. And in other episodes, we'll probably talk a little bit more about what that might look like. But you start with ground rules. You have a chairperson, and they basically have speakers on both sides of the issue, whatever the issue is, and a speaker on the pro side of the issue will speak, and then they'll have a couple of questions from people that can be asked to the chair to make sure that they're not gotcha questions. And then they turn to the other side and have a speaker who has like 2 to 4 minutes to speak, and then you have questions of them. And by the end, you see that there is a lot more complexity to the issue than you realized when you first came in.
So there's a lot going on with Braver Angels, and you've heard the story already about how we've started in Arkansas. Tell our viewers why a TV show.
Well, you know, it's really Carlton Wing's fault, I think. He was a guest on our On the Other Hand broadcast, and for those people who don't know, Carlton is the executive director and the CEO of Arkansas TV, and he asked us to come on for a couple of sessions on the Arkansas Week podcast, not podcast, but show, and I think we didn't scare him off too much because they said, we need more Arkansas-based programming here at Arkansas TV, and so they asked us if we would be willing to do a show and to demonstrate that we can actually have these kinds of conversations that are difficult and lean into them. And we said, that sounds a little scary, but sure, let's try it.
Yeah,
so here we are.
Yes, okay.
So what are viewers going to expect here?
Well, this is a little atypical. I mean, we're going on this whole time talking, just the two of us. From here on out, we expect to have other people here. Our plan is to start off with 15 minutes or so of education for the viewers, talking about maybe something we've run into, a story we have or someone else has, and then we will introduce the guest of the week that we'll interview for about 30 minutes. Usually, again, like on our podcast, it'll be someone who has done some active work in the community to better the community, to reach across various types of division. And we're going to try to cast a wide net, you know, in who all we invite on and get on. And then that's probably going to be for about another 25 episodes. And then the last 5 or so, if I've got that counting right, then we're going to ask for, you know, several pairs of people who are going to talk about, with respect, that's going to be our ground rules, about something that they disagree on. Mm-hmm. And so what we'd suggest is if any of you know of a pair of people who have some opinions that differ on an important topic, but are capable and willing to come on here and talk with some degree of respect and civility, we have a couple of ideas, but we need some more ideas.
So, you know, as people are starting to listen to us, I think having curiosity, desire to learn more, you know, visiting our 2 websites that we mentioned earlier, braverangels.org is the national website. Then we have arkansas.braverangels.org that people can also look at. And when I think about what success looks like for me in a relationship, if I'm following these principles, it's really, I am understanding other people. I'm trying to state other people's views clearly and fairly. I'm leaning into difficult conversations. I'm working together with others to help solve problems in communities, but it is not an easy task to do, and we are not going to get it perfectly to do that. So, Glenn, what can our listeners do now?
Well, for our viewers, we ask that you be open to hearing what we and the citizens that we talk to on the show have to say. We encourage you to try to change your approach to political conversations, even if it's just a little, just to see how it works. Be aware, nothing's going to change easily or immediately or at least very little, but you may see some improvements that can motivate you to keep trying. And then, as April has alluded to, get involved with your community however you can. I know we have different amounts of bandwidth, but it may be a community group, your church, a neighborhood group, letters to the editor, even educating yourself before you vote. Do something like that, whatever you have the ability to do. And then, as you said, you can learn more about us at our Arkansas website, arkansas.braverangels.org, or the national website, braverangels.org. And you can always listen to our On the Other Hand podcast, which is found on most podcasting host sites and also is on our Braver Angels Arkansas website.
You know, we've been so honored to do this first episode, Glenn, and thank you so much to our listeners for watching us. We hope that you'll join us for our upcoming episodes as we explore together how to make our communities and relationships better.